topic of this talk is You've Got a Friend in Me, on friendship. The other day, I found in my neighbour's living room a plaque, and the plaque read, "Friends are the sunshine of life." I thought that in one short sentence captured very beautifully how our friends provide essential warmth and light to our lives, the warmth of kindness and compassion, and the light of wisdom and humour. When we think of our times with friends, I'm sure you'll think of the great times, laughter, shared joy. It's been said that friends are the family we get to choose for ourselves. And the Australian-based sinologist Ping Wang, on writing about the Chinese concept of friendship from a Confucian perspective, observed this. Friendship is part of the narrative and morality, particularly of Chinese people, which has been shaped and enriched by the intellectual tradition. In fact, the word for friend appears to be the earliest, one of the oldest texts, called the Classical Changes, or you might know it as the I Ching, and I've underlined the character for friend in red. Now, for this talk, I'm going to be looking at 3 questions. What really makes a friendship? What should we look for in a friend? And how can we be a good friend from the Confucian perspective? I would suggest that these questions are as interesting to us today as they were for Confucius and his students over 2,000 years ago. And understanding a bit more about these questions provides fresh insights and ideas for our building rewarding and lasting friendships. So in Confucian philosophy, friendship is a very important category of interpersonal relationships. Now, if you think about it, everyone, regardless of where we're born, who we are, well, everyone is bound to have some friends because no person is really an island. Confucian thought categorizes our interpersonal relationships into 5 main categories or types, as you might have remember, Catherine, before. 3 types within the family, and they're the relationship between spouses, the relationship between parent and child, and the relationship between siblings. Now, beyond the family, you have the relationship between leader and subordinate, or leader and team member, as we do in the workplace between employer and employee, and also the relationship among friends. Now, from the Confucian perspective, there's a bit of a hierarchy built into the roles of leader and subordinate, but friendship is among equals. So friends aren't necessarily defined by family or work, but you obviously need to be associated with a friend in some way. Is it just about attending the same school or working at the same place? Well, it's obviously a little bit more than that, because, and also it's more than sharing the same interests, because, for example, not everyone who enjoys tennis are called friends. So the first question is, what makes a friendship from the Confucian perspective of the Confucian tradition? Well, if we look at that, we know that friends are important for our happiness and emotional well-being. But Confucius also tells us that friends can help us realize our innate goodness. There's a depth to this relationship. It's more than what we can see here. There's a depth. And in the Confucian context, friendship is no ordinary acquaintance, because there's some aspect of the relationship where you help each other practice virtue and develop moral excellence. These sorts of friends trust each other enough to value honest feedback and advice. Now, if we look at the Chinese character for friend, this is how it's written today on the left. On on the right is a page from a Chinese dictionary, the first Chinese dictionary to arrange the characters in order of the character components. And the dictionary is called the Shuwen Jiezi, which roughly translates to explaining graphs and analysing characters. Now, this dictionary definition for the character for friend tells us two things. First, it tells us that a friend is someone who shares the same aspirations. And the second thing it tells us is that, well, this character is written in the way that it is because it's meant to depict two hands. Now, this might be more directly appreciated when we look at the earlier form here that I've encircled, what's known as the seal script. And you see the two hands. The two hands sort of facing the same direction as well, which sort of brings to mind, our allies, pulling on the same side in a tug of war, perhaps. Now, this was the definition for this Chinese character for friend that was derived from this dictionary compiled in the 2nd century by the Han Dynasty philologist Chen. Now, this character has also been interpreted in the 18th century by the Qing Dynasty scholar Duan Yucai. And he interpreted this character, with these two hands, as representing two people. Two people working together, supporting each other, just like our left and right hands. It's as if one cannot do without the other. So the Chinese character friend alerts us to the idea that at the heart of the relationship between friends is a shared commitment to moral excellence and support for each other to achieve moral excellence. In the Confucian context, a friend is someone who can actively contribute to a person's ethical cultivation. It's a hands-on endeavour, if you like. In the words of the early 20th century Singaporean scholar, Lin Boon Keng, or Lin Wenqing, he emphasises that the Confucian view of friendship is that friends are not only to be regarded as a source of pleasure, but also to be remembered as the moral lever whereby the good of our fellow human beings is to be promoted. So there's a shared commitment to ethical cultivation among friends. And part and parcel of that is a mutual appreciation for moral progress and moral achievement. Now, just to give us a bit of a flavour of this idea of Confucian friendship, I'd like to share with you a well-known story of the scholar official Su Shi. Su Shi lived in the 11th century, time known as the Song Dynasty in China. Given the government sponsorship of Buddhist learning at the time, Confucian scholars like Su Shi would associate with Buddhist masters and also learn from the Buddhist teachings. Now, Su Shi prided himself on his broad learning, and he was close friends with the Buddhist master by the name of Fo Ying. Now, one time, Su Shi felt particularly proud of his progress in personal cultivation, and he put pen to paper. He wrote a poem, and in this poem, he expressed that he had attained the level of being unmoved by the 8 winds. You're probably wondering, what are the 8 winds? Well, the 8 winds is actually a Buddhist term, and it refers to the 8 conditions that prevent someone from progressing along the path to enlightenment. The 8 winds refer to these 8 conditions. They're prosperity, decline, honour, disgrace, praise, censure, pleasure, and suffering. And you'll notice that half of these conditions are actually positive. And that's because people are typically inclined towards the pursuit of prosperity, honour, praise, and pleasure. Unfortunately, under such favourable conditions, it's all too easy to become complacent and then veer into excess, which prevents us from progressing along the moral path. Now, at the same time, people can get caught up with in their aversion to decline, disgrace, censure, and suffering. So Su Shi wrote a poem expressing that he was able to remain unmoved in face of these 8 winds. And he sent his poem along to his good friend, Master Fo Ying. Master Fo Ying took one look at the poem and he wrote just one word back. Sent his reply right back. Now, on receiving the master's reply, Su Shi was so incensed by the seemingly offensive remark that he set off right away to, see the master. When he arrived, Master Fo Ying happened to be away in another town, but he left a note at the gate for Su Shi. And the note read, "Unmoved by the 8 winds, affected by a small fart." So obviously, Su Shi and Master Fo Ying were such close friends that the master could anticipate Su Shi's reaction. He could predict that Su Shi would be so upset that he would immediately, set out crossing the river to demand an explanation from the master in person. So all Master Fo Ying needed to do was to remind Su Shi to, stop kidding himself. The relationship between the two was obviously strong enough that the master could, test him, criticize him, and encourage or exhort him to do better. And it illustrates that friendship is a relationship based on mutual trust and support in moral cultivation. Now, it's friends like Master Fo Ying that can help keep us grounded. They can burst our bubbles of conceit and complacency. We know that friends are there to lend an ear or lend a hand in our hour of need. They tell us what we need to know. They're not just there to flatter us or to make us feel good about ourselves all the time. They're there to keep our thoughts on track. Our friends are there to remind us of what's really important in life, where we need to improve, when we've made a mistake, and, how we can bring out our full potential. So it suggests that friends like these are really worth their weight in gold because they can really help us improve and perfect ourselves on a day-to-day basis. Well, in the Analects, we see Master Zeng, and he's one of Confucius's foremost, most prominent students. And he had this to say about friendship. Master Zeng said, "Through culture, the exemplary person makes friends, and through friends, they develop their humanity." Now, the key word here is the word culture. And given the sort of historical context, what Master Zeng is referring to is improving oneself through cultural refinement, the learning of the manners, rituals, like the ritual etiquette that we heard before, the practices, principles, and standards that we find in the earliest classical Chinese texts that were traditionally attributed to the most enlightened thinkers, and they were called sages. So in today's world, this would be coming together as equals to share and learn from one another our ideas on the cultivation of ethical character. And as you can imagine, this scope is actually quite broad. It could mean a conference or simply just, having a cup of tea together. Our views on learning and practice for character cultivation. Now, this coming together is essentially a meeting of minds. And as we said before, friends should share the same aspirations. And we see this inherently in the Chinese words used to describe good friends. For example, 志同道合, meaning someone who shares the same goals and aspirations and taking the same approach. 知己, someone who understands me like a bosom friend. Or 知音, meaning someone who understands, knows my tune. So it's not about what our friends wear, where they live, their career or financial status. True friends are certainly linked, as expressed in these quotes here. And in the Confucian context, the link is characterized by shared aspirations of cultural refinement for ethical character. So you can have two or more people being committed to helping one another to do better as human beings. How do they do that? Well, they do so by perfecting their knowledge and by setting a good example in moral learning and practice. And if you think about it, people often find it far easier to notice the faults of others compared to themselves. So it's often through our friends, through their words and conduct, that we discover our own strengths and shortcomings. Now, even when some people realize their shortcomings, their faults, they can sometimes find it difficult to get themselves to change, as Confucius observed here. In the Analects, Confucius said, I've yet to see anyone who can recognize his own faults and, look inside of himself and actually blame themselves as opposed to everyone else. So now, yes, it can be hard to correct our faults, and that's where our friends come in. Now, if we go back to the passage before, Master Zong said, through culture, the exemplary person makes. Notice that this is about the exemplary person. It's someone who is after moral excellence. They're not there to win friends and influence people to try to get ahead or improve sales. They're someone who is actively cultivating their ethical character. And we find that these sentiments are actually echoed in the Mencius, the text called Mencius. Now here we have on the left a depiction, illustration of what the historical Mencius might look like. And the text is a record, I suppose, of Mencius's words, conversations. And if you don't already know, Mencius is the Chinese philosopher who was born about 100 years after Confucius in the 4th century before the Common Era. And he's recognized as the second sage in the Confucian tradition, second only to Confucius himself. So in the Mencius, the text, it records that Mencius said, between one another, friends do not presume upon the advantage of being the elder or of high rank or of having family connections. To befriend someone is to befriend their virtue. So Mencius makes it clear that you shouldn't rely on the advantage of being an elder or high rank, senior, idea of relying on the advantage of age, power, or prestige. Those sorts of friendships or those sorts of friends, they tend to be self-interested or self-serving. They're after profit, power, and prestige. Virtuous friends, on the other hand, they'll have your interests at heart. They'll sincerely try to help you improve yourself and progress along the path of moral cultivation. And that's why Confucius was adamant that we associate with those who will help us develop and achieve, develop our virtue and achieve virtues like humanity. Now we can see in the next passage when Confucius was asked by his student, Zigong here, about how to achieve humanity. Confucius said, a craftsman who wishes to do good work must first sharpen their tools. In whatever country you might settle in, offer your services to the most virtuous ministers and befriend scholars who cultivate humanity. Now, there's a lot in this passage, and we'll take it bit by bit. Confucius really understands his students, and Zigong is someone who can easily become complacent. So Confucius sort of starts with an analogy involving a craftsman having to transform some raw material into something that is more valuable, useful. And this analogy involving craftsman obviously implies effort and work. Now, this analogy with shaping the raw material the craftsman has to use tools, often made of different materials. You can sort of see here whether he's working on wood or stone, etc. And this is, I suppose, analogous to a person who has to rely on their friends to refine their ethical character and to develop their virtues like humanity. Like the raw jade inside the stone that has to be cut and carved and polished, we have to work on ourselves to develop and bring out the virtue that's inside each of us. So we have to make the most of our conditions. And that's everything around us. Our conditions includes the people around us and even the time that we have on this earth. So we make the most of our resources, our conditions, to in whatever we do, to try to improve our ethical character and realize moral excellence. Now, Confucius then draws our attention to two aspects of our condition. The first is to do with our work. He does so when he says, whatever country you may settle in, serve the most virtuous ministers. And as we know, work is a very fundamental part of our lives. We want to ensure that the people we work for, people we work with, share the same aspirations. And so Confucius directs us to serve the most virtuous ministers. In those times, they would have been the ones who really had the interests of the state, the interests of the people at heart. Now, then outside of our work, we have our friends, and we should be friends with those who are working on their moral excellence. Befriend scholars who cultivate humanity. You're probably wondering, well, how do I go about identifying those friends? Now, what sort of characteristics might they have? Well, before we explore those very important questions, I'd like to draw together the core elements of what defines friendship in the Confucian tradition. So what makes a friendship? Well, we appreciate our friends for being with us through thick and thin. They listen and they care about us. But perhaps the most important characteristic from a Confucian perspective is that our friends will share our aspirations towards moral excellence. And they'll support us. They're willing and able to support us to develop our ethical character. And develop our ethical character through cultural refinement, as we discussed before. Learning and practicing of the manners, the rituals, the principles, practices, standards of appropriate patterns of conduct. Now, so that's what makes a friendship from the Confucian perspective. Well, what should we look for then in a friend? Well, in the Analects, Confucius tells us that there are 3 types of friends that are helpful and 3 types of friends that are harmful. Friendship with a straightforward, understanding, and the well-informed is helpful. Friendship with the hypocritical, the sycophantic, and the glib-talking is harmful. Now, a contemporary Confucian scholar, Li Pingnan, tells us that we don't need to look for talented all-rounders. As long as a person has one or more of these 3 traits, or straightforward, or understanding, and or well-informed, well, they're a friend to have. We can't expect anyone to be perfect. So, but what do we mean by straightforward, understanding, and well-informed? Let's take a look. Well, straightforward friends, they're open and honest. They can be candid. They're people who say what they mean and then mean what they say. And so certainly wouldn't take advantage of us. And they have this upright, sincere attitude. That's a straightforward friend. And then we have the understanding friends. They're very forgiving. They don't hold grudges. They're very considerate. And it's important because these are qualities that we would want to develop in ourselves. So having them around provides us with these positive role models to emulate. So that's the understanding friends. And then last but not least is well-informed friends. Now, these are people who have broad learning, they're very knowledgeable, but they're not obsessive or fixated. Learning from these well-informed friends broadens our outlook and understanding of the world around us. So the helpful friends are straightforward, understanding, and or well-informed. And just to give an example of one of these helpful friends, I'll share with you another anecdote, also from the Song Dynasty. And it's about a high official by the surname of Su. We'll call them Officer Su, and his good friend Ying Tun. Now, Officer Su, he submitted a memorial to the throne, and a memorial is a sort of formal written piece of advice. It set out his recommendations on various state matters. Unfortunately, his recommendations were all ignored. And not only were they ignored, well, the ruler sort of took offense, and Officer Su was demoted and relegated to a role in the provinces, far from the capital as a penalty. Well, on his way to his new job, he stopped by the home of his good friend, Ying Tun, and he sort of complained to his friend that, unfairly treated because, he served the court with nothing but the utmost sincerity and loyalty. And, this is his outcome. Now, on hearing this, his friend, Ying Tun, sort of asks him two questions. He said, well, at the time when you submitted this memorial, were you acting in the interests of the people? Or were you more, interested in your own career advancement? If you were acting in the interests of the people, then you should cheerfully head on to this new job. But if you were more interested in your own career advancement, your career prospects, then this demotion would count as like punishment. Now, these words got through to Officer Su. He stopped feeling sorry for himself. He stopped feeling, harboring resentment against the court. And I would say that Ying Tun is someone who is straightforward, well-informed enough to help keep his friend, Officer Su, their thoughts on track. So that's one example of a helpful friend. Besides the helpful friends, there are also three types of harmful ones, and I've sort of highlighted them in red. It's a bit of a caution. You have the hypocritical friends. They say one thing, do another. They're misleading and deceptive, and they pretend to be better than they really are. And they might even get away with it because, they're good at flattery, very smooth talkers. Then there are the sycophantic friends. They're the charmers. They make us feel that we are excellent when we're not. And the trouble is that, some people might actually believe them and then lack any motivation to try to improve themselves because they think they're already good enough, right? Or they could become, arrogant. And as they say, pride comes before the fall. So that's the sycophantic friends. And then there are the glib-talking friends. And these are people who are, they speak so confidently, so good with their words, that they can win any argument, no matter how unreasonable. And you could probably pick up a bit of a trend here. The common denominator, you could say, among these sorts of friends is that they're very persuasive speakers. And it's easy to be around people who seem to know the right things to say. But at the end of the day, whether they're harmful or helpful, lies in the intentions, their motives behind their words, what they say. Are their intentions selfless or selfish? Now, the attitude towards dishonest words, I think about the passage from Master Xun or Xunzi, and Xunzi, well, he lived after Mencius, and he was the leading Confucian scholar of his day. He held a high office at one point, And it's through his writing, his teachings, that he hoped to benefit society. And many of his students certainly went on to government careers and to serve at court. Well, Xunzi, in the text called Master Xun, records that he wrote, or he said, that someone who correctly criticizes me is my teacher, and someone you can really learn from. Someone who correctly praises me is my friend, but someone who flatters me is my enemy or my foe. So that sort of highlights the danger of these dishonest words, whether they're from hypocritical, sycophantic, or glib-talking friends. And just to clarify that, a teacher can also be a friend. There's someone you look up to, learn from. So that's from Xunzi. Now, another thing to bear in mind is that we tend to spend a lot of time with our friends. And as a result, we tend to pick up their habits, for better or worse. And this can happen subconsciously. Now, the company of good friends and helpful friends has been likened to a room of fresh flowers, diffusing their fragrance. And these flowers, the fragrance envelopes everything in an atmosphere of delightful perfume. Now, in contrast, the society of harmful friends is like entering a fish shop. The unpleasant odor of the fish is at first almost insufferable. But, in the course of time, the smell ceases to be disagreeable. And why that is because, our sense of smell, the olfactory sense, becomes paralyzed, so that we stop picking up the offensive smells, so that those who remain in that fish shop may no longer be conscious of anything smelling offensive at all. And so similarly, the corrupting influence of harmful friends, their negative examples, can blunt our moral sense and make us condone that which we would otherwise condemn. So it sort of tells us to take care in the company that we keep. If you think about it, to be able to identify and associate with the helpful friends, we really have to be the friend that we would wish for. And in trying to be this ideal friend, it sort of brings to mind this piece of advice from Confucius in the Analects. Confucius said, hold faithfulness and sincerity as first principles. Don't have friends that differ from yourself, and don't be afraid to correct your faults. Now, faithfulness and sincerity, these traits relate to being conscientious in our learning and practice for, ethical character. Now, it can probably sound a bit abstract. So if I use an example, people tend to find it easier to think about their physical self as opposed to their moral self. So in physical terms, sincerity might be, do I really want to be fit and healthy, keep healthy, make healthy choices? And then faithfulness would be, well, do I keep at it and see things through to the finish? So that's an analogy, and we can certainly apply those principles to our moral self-cultivation. For example, we might choose to learn and practice even when others, the people around us, do not. And interestingly, we'll find that the more that we learn and practice, the more we develop our moral qualities, the more faith we have in the texts, and the more confidence we have in ourselves and our innate potential for moral greatness. So I'm sure you'll all agree that at the start of our ethical cultivation, a conducive environment. You want to be around people, friends, who will encourage you to develop your ethical character. It's a bit like being in this class. You can see in the picture, the teacher might be far away, right at the front of the class, but it's a good thing to have the people around you. We'll call them, your exercise friends. Based on their posture, you can correct yourself. The helpful friends literally show us how we might want to improve. When we happen to see a friend make a mistake, well, we can reflect on ourselves and take extra care not to make the same mistake. And obviously, being their friend, we can help them realize that, they've made a mistake. But I'll go into that a little bit later. Now, so it's important to have friends, people around you with the same aspirations, or at least they'll encourage you to progress on the path of ethical cultivation. Now, Mencius points out that aside from people, our contemporaries, we can look to friends in the past, from the past, in terms of the positive and negative exemplars that we find in the time-honoured texts, whether that be the classics, the historical writings, the masters or the philosophical writings, or the literary works. Now, Mencius here is talking to a student, and he's saying, the good scholar, someone who is learning and actively cultivating their ethical character. Well, they're going to be friends with other good scholars in the village, in the state, abroad, but they could also go back to learn from those in the past. And actually, Mencius recommends that such friends are the best. So we don't need to feel limited to the people that we know or meet today. For example, when we read the Analects, we can reflect on the Confucius that emerges from the page. Would I be able to say what Confucius said? Do I really believe that he's right? If not, what's stopping me? How can I change? Now, the other idea that can be misinterpreted here is not having friends that differ from oneself. Does that mean that we start excluding people or stick to a small clique? Well, let's see what Confucius' students have to say. In this passage, they were both students of Confucius, but they in time, had students of their own. And we see that here, the students of Zixia, they ask of Zizhang about, who to associate with, who should we be friends with? Zizhang replies, well, what does your teacher, Zixia, what did he say? And they replied, well, Zixia said, associate with the right sort of people. Avoid people who are not of the right sort. Well, Zizhang has a different idea. And he says, an exemplary person exalts those of virtue and is tolerant of everyone. He praises those who are truly efficacious and is sympathetic with those who are less so. If I have great virtue, of whom should I not be tolerant of? If I don't have great virtue, people will avoid me. How would I be able to avoid them? So we can see that both Zixia and Zizhang, they both refer to friends, of a moral dimension to our friends. But how do we reconcile these two perspectives? They're a little bit different. You could say that Zixia is talking about first principles, advising his students to make sure they take care in the company that they keep. They want to be associating, befriending those of good moral character, the virtuous friends. Now, Zizhang, on the other hand, he's trying to develop their judgment a little bit, and he's talking about relating with others generally. Now, most commentaries, they support the idea that whether one should follow or avoid a friend is in our minds. We ask ourselves, would it be right for me to follow what the other person is doing? When we decide that question, we'll know, whether we want to exalt or tolerate or praise or sympathize. And regardless of what we decide, we should show respect for others. So as to what to look for in a friend, we know that we want friends who are helpful to our cultivation of ethical character. And they'll be straightforward, understanding, and or well-informed. We want to look for positive role models. They'll share our aspirations towards excellence. We want to look for those who are sincere and faithful in their learning and practice with ethical character. And of course, we'll be discerning in our choices of what behaviours we want to follow. But we should always maintain a respectfulness for everyone. So that's about what to look for in a friend. Now, how can we be a good friend? Well, in the Analects, Confucius is asked by his student about what it takes to be a scholar. And the scholar in this context is someone who is learning, for sure, but who's also actively cultivating their ethical character. So that's why it's relevant. And Mencius sort of says, well, being earnest, exacting, and amicable, you could be a scholar. Earnest and exacting with friends, amicable with siblings. So notice that there are 3 key words: earnest, exacting, and amicable. And there's a distinction drawn between siblings and friends. With siblings, we are to be amicable. We, can't be too harsh or severe because we want to maintain the harmony within our family, prevent discord. Whereas with friends, we can be perhaps a bit more direct, earnest and exacting with our friends. But obviously we need to strike a balance. We don't want to go too far. So in another passage where Confucius is asked by another student about friendship, he replies, give them loyal advice, guide them tactfully, and if that fails, desist. Don't humiliate yourself or expose yourself to rebuff. And this relates to being honest with our friends. Obviously, to give them advice, to give them guidance, we have to build up a certain amount of trust in that relationship. But friends ultimately have this moral duty to guide and encourage each other towards ethical conduct. And at the same time, there's a moral duty to help prevent and correct misconduct. At the end of the day, it's not enough just to have good advice. We also have to know how and when to give that advice. We have to know how much our friend can take. And when might be the best time to proffer our counsel. It's also about striking a balance. With some friends, we have to know to stop. If what we say fails, we have to stop. Don't strain the friendship. Of course, with some friends, we just know that they won't listen. So we can think about using our actions to show them what we mean to say. For example, one time the ruler of the state of Wei, he wanted to ask Confucius about military tactics, or Confucius to give him advice in terms of military strategies and tactics. And Confucius pretends not to know. And he votes with his feet by leaving that state the following day. And he didn't want any part of the state going to war. So is that being honest? Well, being honest is honesty for our friends' sake. Now, on the idea of respectfulness, I think it's also important to look at this passage where Confucius once praised his contemporary, Master Yan Pingzhong. And Master Yan was an accomplished statesman, philosopher, and his words were recorded, transmitted, and even translated, as we can see here. Confucius said, Yan Pingzhong was skilled in interacting with others. Even toward those he had known for a long time, he remained respectful. And there are 2 interpretations of this last phrase. He remained respectful. One interpretation is that Master Yan remained respectful to his friends, or others, his friends still continued to respect him after having known him for a long while. Now, some people who've known their friends for a long time, they go back a long way, sometimes they've grown apart. They may have had different views or disagreements. And over time, people may become overly familiar and forget their initial good manners sometimes. It can be difficult to remain respectful, as if you'd just met them after you've known them for a long time. Master Yan was able to do so, and as a result, his friends afforded him the same respect. So in answer to the question of how can we be a good friend, well, from the Confucian perspective, a good friend is someone who is willing and able to help us develop our ethical character and work towards moral excellence. Someone who will be there for us in all the steps in between, like the picture here. They'll listen to us, give us advice, guidance, and they will always try to love and respect us. Now, in friendship, we receive profound joy and, from communicating with those who truly understand and appreciate us. And the hands here, sort of in these photos, sort of remind me of the character for friend with the two hands. It's a very hands-on endeavour. But not only that, friendship gives us vital support to develop our ethical character and realise the full potential of innate goodness. Now, I hope that these perspectives on what makes a friendship, what to look for in a friend, and how we can be a good friend can contribute to our building rewarding and lasting relationships. Wish you all good health, great friends, and happiness always. Thank you very much for your attention.